I was halfway through my usual morning walk along the southern edge of my property when Scout, my old German Shepherd, froze mid-step. His ears perked, nose-twitching body taut with attention. I stopped following his gaze toward the dense stand of ponderosa pines just beyond the tree line. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then it came deep, mechanical, and low. The kind of rumble that doesn't come from the wind or wildlife, but from something man-made, heavy machinery. It wasn't the first time I'd heard engines in this area. I live on the edge of a nature reserve, 212 acres of federally protected pine and cedar. Some of it passed down from my father's generation before he deeded it to the state. But in all my years walking this stretch of land, I'd never heard machines this close. And certainly not before 8 a.m. on a Tuesday. Scout let out a soft growl. That was enough. I tightened the strap on my backpack, patted his head, and veered off the walking trail into the underbrush. The morning air was still cool, but a slight heat shimmer hovered just above the ground. Dry season. Fire season. All the more reason to worry about strangers with engines in the woods. As we crept through the trees, the sound grew louder, metal clanking engines shifting under load, and the distinct beeping of a truck backing up. I crouched near a fallen log and peered through the branches. That's when I saw it. Two massive flatbed trucks sat idling next to a stack of freshly cut timber. Each log was stripped clean uniform in size, exactly the kind of high-quality ponderosa pines that had grown in the inner reserve, untouched for decades. Nearby, two men in reflective vests moved quickly, hoisting logs with a small loader and strapping them down like it was just another day at the job site. Except this wasn't a job site. This was federal land. And then I saw the logo. My stomach sank. Painted on the driver's side doors of both trucks was the unmistakable seal of our HOA Valley Pines Estates, a swooping pine tree next to a winding road stamped in dull green and gold. The trucks belonged to them. I felt a flush of heat crawl up the back of my neck. I'd dealt with plenty of nonsense from the HOA over the years. Warnings for leaving my shed door open too long. Threats for using an unapproved mailbox, even a citation once for painting my house trim. 2 shades too dark, but this wasn't petty politics. This was theft. Environmental crime. Destruction of protected land. I reached for my phone, started filming, but the angle was too obscured. Scout let out another low growl, and one of the workers glanced toward the tree line. I ducked and pressed my back to the log, heart thudding. They weren't supposed to be here. That much I knew. But I also knew that confronting them now alone could escalate fast. I backed away quietly, made my way down the ridge, and returned to the walking trail. Once I was back in open terrain, I pulled out my phone again and scrolled through my contacts until I found it Laura Torres, Assistant Surveyor, with the county's Environmental Protection Division. She owed me a favor. Years ago, I'd helped her get access to old forest maps from my father's estate. She was meticulous, honest, and not afraid to piss people off when it meant defending the law. She didn't answer. I left a voicemail. Laura, it's Daniel. I think something's going on in the reserve. I just saw 2 HOA trucks loading timber, pines, good ones, near the south boundary ridge. I have some video, but not enough. This isn't right. Please call me back. I paused, then added, they're cutting trees inside protected territory. After hanging up, I looked back toward the ridge. The trucks were still there. The loader's engine had gone quiet, but I could hear chains clinking and the occasional bark of a radio. I had questions spinning in my head. What justification did they have? Did the HOA somehow acquire part of the reserve? Or were they betting on no one noticing? Maybe they thought the boundary line was fuzzy, but it wasn't. I had copies of those maps. My father had walked every inch of that land before he handed it over to the state. He planted trees there himself after the '79 wildfire. We held family gatherings in that grove. I carved my initials into one of those trees when I was 11 years old. This wasn't just timber, this was legacy. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, lights off, watching the footage I'd managed to record. It wasn't much. A few glimpses of truck wheels, the corner of a log, the faint outline of a worker. Not enough for a report, but enough to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. At 11:17 p.m., Laura called me back. "You're absolutely sure it was the HOA?" she asked, voice low. "They had the logo on both trucks. You got plates?" "No, I couldn't get close enough." She exhaled sharply. "Okay, give me the coordinates if you can. I'll cross-reference with the county map overlays. If they're operating inside the reserve, they're in violation of at least 3 environmental statutes. I emailed her the GPS coordinates, then grabbed the hard copy map from the drawer under my father's old compass. The boundaries hadn't changed. The place I saw them cutting was well within the state reserve, not even close to HOA jurisdiction. At midnight, I couldn't sleep. I took Scout and drove out to the edge of my back pasture, which overlooks the tree line. From there, you can see the dirt path they carved into the woods. It was faint by night, but the tire ruts glowed under the moonlight. They were deep, frequent, and fresh. Scout sat beside me, ears flicking. "We're not letting them get away with this," I told him. "Not this time." The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The image of those trucks hadn't left my mind all night. I couldn't shake the sound of the loader's metallic grind or the sight of that HOA logo hauling out pieces of forest I had watched grow for 40 years. It sat in my chest like a splinter. I poured myself a mug of coffee, threw on my boots, grabbed a pair of binoculars, and called Scout to the truck. We didn't take the usual trail this time. Instead, I drove around the back pasture down the old fire lane that skirts the edge of the reserve. Most folks didn't even know it was there, an access path from when my father used to manage controlled burns. I parked near the thicket where the path narrowed and continued on foot, staying low. The morning mist clung to the ground, silencing our steps. Scout, sensing my quiet urgency, padded beside me like a shadow. About 100 yards in, I found it. A newly carved road. It hadn't been there a month ago. The pines on either side were freshly cut, the ground leveled and packed by the constant grind of tires and treads. There were no posted signs, no permits pinned to trees like required for legal work. Just a raw scar slicing through protected woodland wide enough for a logging truck. Someone had done this deliberately, quickly, quietly. I took a slow walk down the dirt road, making note of every broken stump, every gouge in the earth. I snapped photos, checked GPS coordinates, then turned and hiked deeper into the forest. That's when I found the staging area again, only now it was bigger. 3 trucks this time. A bulldozer, a generator, humming softly in the shadows. They were getting bold. But what caught my eye wasn't the machinery. It was the man standing next to the log's clipboard in hand. He wore a clean polo shirt with the same HOA emblem on his chest. Tall, trim, maybe in his mid-40s. Not a laborer, a supervisor. He looked like he'd never held a chainsaw in his life. His face was smug, confident. He didn't look like someone worried about being caught. That's what scared me. I crept closer and recognized him. Craig Delaney, HOA board member, self-appointed Director of Grounds and Environmental Development, a title he made up 2 years ago when he convinced the board to grant him expanded authority over common areas. He once tried to have my wood fence replaced because it clashed with the uniform aesthetic of Valley Pines. Now here he was in the middle of protected forest, managing a crew like it was a private operation. I watched him wave over a worker point to something deeper in the woods, then check his watch and walk back to a white SUV. They weren't just harvesting wood. They were organizing something. I slipped away, backtracked through the trees, and returned home. I needed records, documents, proof that this wasn't just some mistake in land boundary. If they were going to claim this was within their authority, I needed to show it wasn't. My father had kept every land transfer survey, easement, and conservation contract in labeled binders, meticulous to the point of obsession. It was all in the back study, under lock and key. I pulled out the thickest folder, Nature Reserve Deed and Federal Transfer, 1982-90. Inside was gold. A full-size topographical map dated 1991, signed by both the county and the State Department of Environmental Resources. It clearly marked the boundaries of the reserve, starting 50 feet behind my property line and extending all the way down to the South Basin. The path the HOA trucks were using solidly within that zone. Even better, a notarized letter from my father to the state dated 1993, describing his intent to donate 20 acres to expand the existing protected zone. That land, the very land they were logging, was supposed to be held in perpetuity, and somehow they were logging it under the guise of HOA landscaping. I scanned the documents, uploaded them to a cloud drive, then took a photo of the map and sent it to Laura Torres with a message, "This is what they're taking." 15 minutes later, she called me, her voice sharp. "This is damning," she said. That's not HOA property. Not by a mile. But I checked county filings. They submitted a development request 2 months ago to thin tree density in common buffer zones for fire prevention. That might have been their legal cover. That's a lie, I said. They're removing prime timber. Those aren't thinned brush. That's straight logging. I know. But unless someone files a violation with evidence, the county isn't likely to act fast. And Craig Delaney. His wife's brother is a councilman, so we tread carefully. She paused. Daniel, if you're willing, document everything. Dates, times, photos, videos. If you can catch a truck exiting with cut timber and show it's crossing out of reserve land, we have a case. But we'll need more than a map. I can do that, I said. And Daniel, don't confront them again. If they think you're on to them, they'll bury this fast. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. After we hung up, I sat in silence, staring at the old photo on my desk, me and my dad in front of that forest, after we planted a new row of pines 20 years ago. He used to say stealing from the earth is like stealing from your grandchildren. I'd never understood that fully until now. These weren't just trees. They were anchors, memory, legacy. I went to the garage, pulled out my old Nikon, with the long lens, charged the battery, then prepped a vantage point for my loft. The trees thinned just enough on the south ridge to give me a view of the trucks. If I timed it right, I could catch them coming and going. And this time, I wouldn't miss the plates. I wasn't just watching anymore. I was building a case. The next afternoon, I waited, camera in hand, notebook on the windowsill, Scout pacing by the door like he sensed something building in me. Around 3:15 p.m., I saw dust rising from the reserve road. One truck. A flatbed with deep green panels hauling a full stack of clean-cut pine logs. Same logo, same model. The kind of truck you wouldn't look twice at unless you knew what you were looking for. It rumbled down the makeshift road carved into the forest and merged onto the residential back lane, paved, HOA patrolled, and supposedly restricted to residential traffic. I didn't have time to grab much. Just my phone, the folder with the map copies, and my resolve. I hopped in my truck, told Scout to stay, and followed at a distance. The HOA truck rolled past the cul-de-sac at the edge of Willow Bend and pulled into the utility lot behind the community clubhouse, normally used for storing gardening equipment or staging community events. But now it looked like something else entirely. A row of logs already sat stacked along the back fence, covered with tarps, neatly organized, like they'd been doing this for a while. The driver jumped out of the cab, young, maybe mid-20s, tan, wearing a reflective vest and work gloves. I pulled up slowly, parked on the street, and stepped out with the map folder tucked under my arm. Hey, I called out calm but firm. You mind telling me where those logs came from? He turned surprised. Sorry. I'm a homeowner, I said, gesturing to my ID badge, clipped to my belt. And those logs didn't come from any designated HOA maintenance area. So again, where'd you haul them from? He looked over his shoulder, then back at me. We've got permits. You should talk to the board. I took a few steps closer. I'm not here to yell. I just want to know what part of the reserve you were in. That's protected land, and I happen to know it wasn't approved for harvesting. I don't know anything about that, he said, suddenly defensive. I was told to pick up felled trees from Zone 3. I don't make the rules, man. Zone 3 doesn't exist, I said, pulling out the map. This is the reserve's boundary, as filed with the county and state. Your route cuts right through federally protected property. If you're hauling timber from there, you're violating state and federal law. He blinked. The silence stretched. I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't a criminal. He was a laborer, doing a job. But that also meant someone higher up was feeding him orders without giving him the truth. I'm not trying to get you in trouble, I added, softening slightly. But it's serious. You need to tell your supervisor to stop running these trucks through the reserve. This isn't HOA business. It's theft. He looked down, then back at me. Look, Mr. Daniel, I said. He nodded. Look, Daniel, I'm just told where to go and what to pick up. I've only been on this job 3 weeks. They said we were cleaning up for wildfire safety. I exhaled slowly. Did they say anything about permits, who signed off? No, just that it was HOA approved. I pulled out my phone, pulled up the photo of the logged area, and showed him the GPS tag. Does this look like fire mitigation to you? He didn't answer. At that moment, another truck turned into the lot. Same logo, same load. I watched the driver visibly tense. His gaze shifted behind me. I turned. Craig Delaney was striding toward us from the clubhouse patio button-down shirt, crisp clipboard in hand. "Everything okay here?" he asked, tone sugary with authority. I turned fully, not even close. Craig looked at the young driver. "You can get back to unloading Ben." Ben hesitated, nodded quickly, and moved away. Craig turned back to me with a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Daniel, always a pleasure. What brings you here?" "I saw your trucks logging inside the reserve. I've got video coordinates and the deed map showing it's outside HOA jurisdiction. Want to explain?" Craig's expression didn't change. "We've been authorized to remove hazardous trees as part of our fire prevention initiative. You know how dry this season's been. It's all about safety. Cutting live pines isn't fire prevention. It's timber extraction, and you're doing it on protected land. The board voted. We had a full quorum. It's within our rights." "No, Craig, it's not. You don't have the authority to manage state land." His jaw tensed. I held up the folder, tapped the map. "This is the original conservation easement signed by the state. That road your trucks are using. It cuts 400 yards into protected land, my father's old boundary. Then you should take it up with the board," he said curtly. "You know the channels." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "I already did. You stonewalled me. That's why I've contacted the county and the state." His face twitched. The smile finally cracked. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "You're one man. The board's acting in the best interest of the community. The community didn't vote to strip a forest bare and sell it for profit. You did." He didn't deny it. Just turned and walked away, muttering something to the second driver. As I walked back to my truck, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't afraid. I'd seen corruption before in uniform, in war zones, even in the halls of my own command post. This was the same poison, just wrapped in manicured lawns and monthly fees. When I got home, I typed up everything: time, location, license plates, interactions, GPS data, and sent it to Laura. 15 minutes later, she replied, "I'm forwarding this to the State Environmental Task Force. This is enough to trigger an initial investigation. Stay safe. And if you see more trucks tomorrow, call me first. I'll send someone with a badge." It was happening. They were about to find out what it felt like to be watched. The next morning, I spread the contents of the old wooden file chest across my dining table, sunlight spilling in through the east-facing window. Dust floated in the air like ash as I sifted through the faded maps, legal documents, topographic overlays, and handwritten annotations. My father's legacy spread out like a battlefield map. I needed everything. The HOA was too bold, too confident. They had to believe they had some kind of paper shield protecting them. Maybe a misfiled easement, a loophole, a forged vote. But I knew that land, and I knew how clean the lines had once been drawn. Scout lay at my feet, occasionally lifting his head at the sound of a creaking drawer or the thump of another heavy binder hitting the table. I worked in silence, my hands growing dark with age-worn ink and graphite smudges. Eventually, I found what I was looking for. Map number 14C, Pine Hollow South Slope, survey date, October 1989. Drawn in blue pencil, overlaid with a county topographic print, and signed by two officials from the Department of Environmental Protection and my father himself. The survey clearly delineated the area between our residential development and the Pine Hollow Preserve, a steep ridge that separated HOA-managed land from the federally protected forest beyond. The area being logged clearly within that preserve boundary. But that wasn't all. Tucked into the back sleeve of the map folder was a typed letter from 1993. "To whom it may concern, I, Richard Everett, grant full custodianship of the southern 22 acres parcel ID 7BPHS 217 to the state of Montana as an ecological restoration zone following the 1979 Wildfire Restoration Agreement. This area is to remain untouched with the exception of authorized ecological studies and fire breaks under state supervision. Richard Everett." It was notarized, stamped by the county clerk's office, and still legally binding. There was no way in hell the HOA had any claim to that land. I scanned everything: the maps, the deed letter, the fire restoration agreement, and the 1995 conservation overlay showing the buffer zone around the South Ridge. I compiled them into a PDF, sent them to Laura, and added a hard copy to a manila folder labeled HOA Logging Violation Evidence, Primary. That folder didn't leave my side for the next week. The HOA, meanwhile, kept going. I counted 3 more truckloads over the next 3 days. Each one took the same route cutting through the forest behind Lot 38, using the makeshift road they'd bulldozed between trees loaded with timber from deep within the preserve. I logged each trip down to the minute, filmed the license plates, and captured footage of Craig himself walking the site with a clipboard like a foreman. On Friday, I received an unexpected letter in my mailbox, an official envelope with the HOA seal addressed to Daniel Everett. Inside was a formal cease and desist notice from the HOA legal representative citing ongoing harassment of HOA contractors, interference with operational duties, and repeated unauthorized presence in restricted HOA zones. I laughed out loud. Restricted HOA zones. The irony was almost poetic. They were trying to flip the narrative, paint me as the trespasser, while they illegally harvested federal land. I called Laura immediately. "They're trying to intimidate you," she said. "They know you're close." "Good," I replied, "because I'm about to get closer." That night I went deeper. I pulled out the old metal lockbox beneath my father's desk. The combination had never changed his Army badge number. Inside, among the yellowing birth certificates and faded photographs, was the original land purchase file from 1962. It included parcel maps, mineral rights, water access easements, and, tucked in the back, a letter of boundary dispute settlement from 1980 with the developer who first proposed Valley Pines. That letter confirmed everything. Any incursion beyond the surveyed line agreed upon in this document shall constitute a breach of the conservation covenant and will be subject to immediate forfeiture and legal penalty. Signed, sealed, filed. The HOA had crossed that line. And they weren't just wrong. They were in violation of state-protected conservation covenants. The kind with teeth. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse. I handed the folder to the records officer and asked for a certified copy of the full conservation agreement citing the parcel ID numbers from the 1989 and 1993 files. The clerk, a young man with tortoise-shell glasses and a sense of curiosity that worked in my favor, raised an eyebrow as he scanned through the files. "This one's still active," he said. "Most people don't keep track of conservation overlays like this. Looks like whoever's managing this area now didn't do their homework." "Oh, I think they did," I replied. "They just figured no one else would." He printed off 3 certified documents, each with an embossed county seal, and handed them over. On my way out, I stopped by the Department of Natural Resources satellite office and dropped off a copy for their enforcement unit. They didn't say much, but the moment I mentioned unauthorized logging and HOA trucks, I got a sharp look from the supervisor. By the time I returned home, Laura had texted me, "Got your files. They're bulletproof. Just pass them to a federal liaison. They're bringing in someone next week. Keep eyes open." So I did. From my upstairs loft, binoculars perched on the windowsill, camera tripod always ready. I watched the trucks go in and out. Same patterns, same smug pace. No urgency. No sign that they knew the walls were closing in. But they were. Every log they loaded, every pine they stripped, every turn of their tires on stolen soil, I recorded it. And that cease and desist, I framed it. Because when the subpoenas come, it'll hang right next to them proof that the truth scares the ones who've made a career of lies. It started with a beer. I was at Malone's Hardware, the only place in town where you could buy barbed wire irrigation valves and get a decent draft under the same roof when I ran into Glenn Mathers. Glenn's a city sanitation foreman, the kind of guy who's lived here forever and knows who's sleeping with whose cousin just by listening to the chatter over Monday trash routes. He eyed me from his stool, sipped his beer, then jerked his chin toward the bar. "Everett," he said, "heard you've been stirring the pot over in Valley Pines." I took the stool beside him. "You heard right." He gave a half grin. "Craig Delaney came by the waste station last week. Wanted to know about hauling permits for tree debris. Said they were clearing for fire safety." "Funny," I said, "because that debris looks an awful lot like pristine 30-year-old pine." Glenn's grin vanished. "Yeah, that's what my boys thought too. We got pictures. You want them?" "Absolutely." He finished his beer and motioned to the bartender, then lowered his voice. "You didn't hear this from me, but a few months back, a contractor named Porter & Sons put in a low bid request to haul timber out of unincorporated parcels south of town. Didn't win the contract. Guess who they're subcontracting for now?" "HOA." He nodded. "And guess who owns part of Porter & Sons under a holding LLC registered in Helena?" I felt a cold sweat rise. Delaney. Delaney's wife. And her sister. Looks like they built a shell company last year. I sat back. So that's what this was. This wasn't about fire safety or community aesthetics. This was a timber laundering scheme masquerading as HOA authorized landscaping. They used HOA trucks and workers to avoid permitting fees cut illegally from federally protected land, then sold the lumber under the guise of fire mitigation. The profits funneled through a holding company tied directly to the people making the decisions. It wasn't just unethical. It was organized theft. I left Malone's with Glenn's photos sharp shots of Valley Pines trucks at the waste station, unloading full-length logs, then reloading them onto flatbeds with Porter & Sons branding. I sent everything to Laura. That night, she called me. Daniel, this just turned into something bigger. How big? Potentially RICO-level big. There's mail fraud, wire fraud, environmental crimes, and conflict of interest all in one neat little HOA package. The feds are circling. She paused. But you need to be careful. If they think you're the one feeding us intel, they already suspect it, I interrupted. They sent me a cease and desist. Then you need to stop talking to them. Don't engage. No more confrontations. I won't, I said. I've got what I need. But that wasn't quite true. What I needed was proof of sale. Not just that they were cutting wood, but that they were profiting from it personally. So I started digging. I searched Porter & Sons' corporate filings. The parent LLC was called Birchline Holdings. Birchline had a second DBA doing business as filed under the name Timberline Property Services. Timberline, it turned out, had one notable transaction on record with a regional sawmill down in Missoula, an incoming timber shipment tagged as Urban Salvage Fire Mitigation. The shipment dated 2 weeks after the first HOA trucks started rolling. I printed the public filing, drew lines between the names, and compiled a web of connections. Delaney, his wife, her sister, the shell company, the HOA trucks, the permit request filed and denied, the sawmill sale. It was a chain of greed hidden behind neighborhood bylaws and landscaping jargon. The next morning, I sat at the window again with my camera. Only this time, I wasn't watching trucks. I was watching faces. Delaney showed up again earlier than usual. He stood with two men I hadn't seen before, well-dressed, clean hands, the type of guys who use words like asset transfer and liability risk. They didn't look like contractors. They looked like investors, which meant they were either in on it or about to be. By afternoon, Laura messaged again. I just got word from DOJ liaison. They're interested. They want everything you've got ready for a briefing on Wednesday. I stared at the screen, pulse steady. This was no longer about calling the police on a few logging trucks. This was a federal investigation. I compiled everything. Photos, video maps, filings, scanned letters, license plates, timestamps. Then I added one final piece, a letter. Just like my father had written 30 years earlier. Except this time, it was from me. To whom it may concern, the land being stripped is protected not just by law, but by legacy. My family gave it freely to protect it. We planted every seed on that ridge with our own hands. It was not meant to be stolen for boardroom profit. This isn't landscaping. It's theft. And I am willing to testify to every inch of it. I signed it, scanned it, sent it to Laura. The next morning, 2 unmarked black SUVs were parked half a block from my driveway. And a man in a blue windbreaker walked out into the trail with a long lens camera. They were here. It had begun. It was almost midnight when the sound came again. Low rumbling, persistent. The kind of mechanical thunder that crawled under your skin and made your bones remember something wrong. I was upstairs in the loft, finishing the last annotation on the evidence file I had prepared for the DOJ briefing. Scout was asleep at the foot of the stairs, but his ears twitched the moment I stood. I moved to the window and pulled back the blackout curtain. There they were. 2 trucks, headlights off. Moving slowly down the carved forest road, what they probably thought was stealth, but in the still quiet of that hour, it sounded like an army. They were still running the operation, even after the cease and desist they sent me, even after the county had been tipped off, even with federal eyes watching the area. They were still stealing trees. But this time I was ready. I grabbed my coat, tucked my phone in the front pocket, and slid a compact drone case under my arm. The Mavic was already programmed with coordinates, and the camera had infrared. I'd never had to use it for anything other than spotting deer before. Tonight, it would become a witness, Scout whined as I eased open the back door. I'll be back, I whispered, patting his head. I moved fast through the shadows, sticking to the ridge. The moon was high, but diffused behind wisps of clouds, making it hard to see from a distance, but perfect for cover. Once I reached the top of the trail, I powered up the drone, checked the connection, and launched it into the sky. The screen on my controller lit up with a thermal overlay of the forest canopy. There they were 3 human signatures, 2 large heat signatures matching vehicle engines. The men were walking back and forth between the trucks and the stump field. One was using a chainsaw. My jaw clenched. This wasn't cleanup. This was harvesting. I panned the drone slightly. Then I caught something else. Another small cluster of heat signatures about 50 yards south. A hidden loader. This was an organized crew. I pressed record. From my phone, I opened a second app live streaming the drone's feed directly to a secure cloud backup. Even if they found me, even if they smashed everything, the footage would be preserved. After 15 minutes of footage, I took the next step. I called the non-emergency line for the county sheriff. When the dispatcher answered, I kept my voice calm. This is Daniel Everett. I'm reporting suspected illegal logging activity in the Pine Hollow Preserve. Coordinates are 46119 by 114 3157. I have live drone footage showing 2 HOA trucks and unauthorized equipment inside protected forest land. Please notify a wildlife enforcement officer and the federal liaison assigned to Case File 721-FR. There was a pause. Then, sir, are you currently in proximity to the scene? Yes, but at a safe distance. Understood. Units are being dispatched. Please remain stationary and do not engage. I won't. I hung up and waited. 23 minutes later, the first flashing lights breached the horizon. 2 sheriff's units followed by a black unmarked SUV with government plates pulled up along the southern access road. I watched from above as the trucks below began to scatter, engines roaring to life, figures shouting. One man ran back toward the loader. Another jumped into a flatbed and tried to reverse it through the forest path. Then a spotlight snapped on. Voices boomed. Sheriff's office, kill the engine hands, in the air. The drone feed was shaky. As I tracked the chaos, one man bolting into the trees, another cuffed on the ground. A third tried to ditch something under a tarp, but was tackled before he made it 10 steps. I lowered the drone behind a tree line and powered it down. I was shaking, not from fear but from something harder to name. Relief. Vindication. The taste of something righteous after months of rot. As I made my way down the trail, my phone buzzed again. It was Laura. We got them, she said before I could even speak. They brought a loader tonight, I said. That's not thinning. That's logging. I know. I just got off the phone with Special Agent Hill from the DOJ. He's on site. They're making arrests tonight. They also found paperwork in one of the truck cab's delivery manifests to a sawmill in Missoula. Signed by Timberline Property Services. I stopped walking. That's the LLC, I whispered. The shell company. Yes, she said. With your evidence, they now have cause to seize financial records. This may go far beyond your HOA. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. As I crested the final hill before my house, I looked back down at the forest, half in shadow, half lit by the rotating blue of squad cars. Trees standing like silent witnesses, tall and still scarred, but not broken. When I walked inside, Scout greeted me like I'd just returned from war. In some ways I had. I closed the door, sat on the floor, and hugged him. We stayed like that for a long while. 2 days after the arrests, a man in a Navy windbreaker with DOJ environmental crimes stitched across the back knocked on my door. He didn't flash a badge. He didn't have to. Mr. Everett, he said, extending a hand. I'm Special Agent Thomas Hill. May I come in? I nodded, stepping aside. Scout gave a low growl from under the table, but quieted with a glance. Agent Hill carried a leather folio and a neutral expression, the kind that belongs to people who've seen the worst of human behavior and stopped reacting to it. He took a seat at the dining table right beside the stacks of maps and printouts I hadn't moved since this started. Your drone footage and documentation were instrumental in last night's arrests, he said. We've been watching the HOA board for months, but didn't have a jurisdictional hook. Until now. I nodded, still trying to process that this was real. That the feds were here. That someone believed me. Was it just logging? I asked. He opened the folio and slid a sheet across the table. A list of transactions, names, routing numbers. No, he said. It's a pattern. Timberline's been receiving payments through multiple front companies for almost a year. All of it traced back to properties within Valley Pines and 3 other HOA communities in the state. They used fire prevention as the pretext to request emergency funds, then sold the extracted timber through private mills. I stared at the numbers, the dollar amounts, some of them in the hundreds of thousands. Hill continued. We also uncovered that Delaney used HOA funds to pay off zoning officials. There's a strong chance we're dealing with wire fraud mail, fraud abuse of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to commit environmental crime, possibly racketeering. I looked up sharply. Rico. He gave a subtle nod. That's why I'm here. There was a long silence between us, the kind that buzzes in your teeth. Do you need me to testify? I asked. Yes, he said. You're the only civilian witness with a complete timeline. You documented everything. And he tapped the top of the folio. You're credible. No criminal record. Veteran. Property owner. And more importantly, your father's land donation was what Delaney tried to erase. A knot formed in my throat. Agent Hill let me breathe for a moment. Then he added, We're staging a sting. I blinked. It's already over, isn't it? Not yet, he said. We've arrested 2 contractors and a logistics manager. But we want the full board. Delaney, his wife, their financial officer, and 2 other HOA presidents, who we believe are coordinating similar operations in neighboring developments. And we can't get them all unless they implicate themselves. I leaned back in my chair. The old wood creaked under me. You want me to bait them? I said quietly. He didn't answer directly, just laid out a folder labeled Proposed Meeting Agenda. Valley Pines HOA Emergency Session. Inside was a fake notice calling for a special vote to legitimize ongoing fire mitigation operations. A vote they would believe was a legal maneuver to retroactively cover their tracks. If they spoke openly, discussed profits, acknowledged past actions, or agreed to falsify documents, it would all be recorded. I'm not on the board, I said. No, Hill replied, but they expect you to come. You've rattled their cage. If you show up angry, it will be natural. If they talk freely in front of you, that's on them. It felt risky, but it also felt like justice. Where and when? Saturday, 5 p.m., Community Clubhouse. He stood offering a hand again. This isn't just about Valley Pines, Mr. Everett. If we get this right, we set precedent for every other corrupt HOA in this state. Maybe the country. I watched him leave through the same door I'd opened so many times to threats and warnings. Now maybe it would open to something else. Saturday came fast. I wore my oldest boots, a denim jacket with mud still clinging to the hem, and brought no folder, no paperwork, nothing to make them feel I was there to present, only to witness. The room was full when I arrived. All 7 HOA board members were seated in a semicircle. Craig Delaney at the center. Beside him was his wife, Marlene Sharp's suit clipboard pearls tight against her neck like a noose. 2 other men I recognized vaguely from the HOA newsletter sat stiffly, eyes flicking around like cornered animals. And then the outsiders. 2 men in business casual. One of them I'd seen before at the logging site. He looked uncomfortable. Craig stood as I entered. Daniel, he said. Glad you came. Let's clear the air. He gestured to an open seat near the center. I took it, nodding curtly. He began with a speech about wildfire risk, about protecting property values, about enhancing community aesthetics. It was theater, all of it. But I let him talk. Then the financial officer, Harold Beckett, spoke. Timberline has completed 4 successful extraction runs and is willing to retroactively file for compliance through buffer zone reclassification. Marlene added, We'll draft new language for the fire mitigation policy to reflect this. Once approved, all actions taken this quarter will be considered part of the revised protocol. Craig nodded. That should keep us insulated. There it was. I kept my face still. Harold spoke again. And the funds from the first quarter. We'll code those as a grant reimbursement. The porters can send us a dummy invoice from Mulch Services. That way no one sees a timber receipt. Delaney turned to me. You've made your point, Daniel. Let's be adults about this. You don't want this neighborhood embroiled in legal messes. We can fix this internally. I tilted my head. Internally? He smiled. No more trucks. You've got our word. I leaned forward, elbows on the table. You stripped federal land, Craig. You faked permits. You sold protected timber for profit and used HOA funds to pay yourselves. They stared. I stood up. This isn't internal anymore. And then the clubhouse door opened. 2 federal agents stepped inside. Agent Hill walked in behind them, calm and slow, with a warrant in hand. Marlene Delaney, Harold Beckett. You are under federal investigation for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and violation of the Lacey Act. Chaos erupted. Marlene stood and shouted something about privilege. Craig slammed his palm against the table. One of the outsiders tried to run. It didn't matter. It was done. That night I sat on my porch. Scout lay across my boots. The stars were out. The air smelled of pine again, not sawdust. The forest would recover. So would I. The news broke 2 days later. At 6:02 a.m., my phone buzzed with an alert from the Missoula County Gazette. Federal agents raid Valley Pines. HOA board members face charges in timber fraud investigation. Within hours, the story was everywhere, television, radio, even a segment on national morning news that showed blurry footage of HOA trucks being towed and agents wheeling out banker boxes from the community clubhouse. By noon, I had 3 voicemails from neighbors I hadn't heard from in years. The first was from Helen Kwan, who once voted to fine me for storing lumber behind my garage. Daniel, sorry, I didn't know. None of us did. I just saw the news. I feel sick. The second was from a teenager I barely knew, a high school junior named Max, who had taken pictures of the trucks for a school project and now wanted to share them with investigators. The third was from the postmaster. I think there's a federal summons in your name, but don't worry. It's for testimony, not indictment. I almost laughed at that one. I wasn't the one who needed to worry about indictment. By Wednesday, the full list of charges was public. Craig Delaney wire fraud, conspiracy to commit mail fraud, destruction of federal property, and willful misrepresentation of HOA bylaws to execute personal financial gain. Marlene Delaney, conspiracy money laundering through shell LLCs and obstruction of justice. Harold Beckett, falsification of financial records, misuse of HOA dues, and participation in racketeering activity under the RICO Act. The charges alone could carry decades in prison. But what stunned the public even more was the trail of paper uncovered behind them. Hidden contracts with regional lumber mills, hush payments to a zoning officer, and a sprawling scheme involving 3 other neighborhoods across the county. And it all started here, with the sound of chainsaws in the woods. On Thursday night, the HOA held what would be its last board meeting, though this one wasn't called by the board. It was an emergency session summoned by the homeowners themselves. The room was packed. More than 100 people. Faces I'd only known through passing waves or heated annual meetings. People who once crossed the street to avoid me now came up with handshakes and wide eyes, thanking me for saving the neighborhood. I didn't feel like a savior. I felt like a witness to a crime that had been waiting to happen. Still, I took the floor when they asked me to speak. I kept it simple. I didn't do this to take anyone down, I said. I did it because what they were doing was wrong. They weren't protecting us. They were exploiting us. And worse, they were destroying something sacred, something meant to outlive us. I pulled the old conservation map from my folder, held it up. This forest was my father's legacy. He gave it to the state to protect. The fact that we let anyone convince us that it could be chipped away in silence, that's on all of us. Silence, then applause. But I didn't smile, because I knew the cost. A week later, subpoenas went out to the board's remaining alternates. Bank accounts were frozen. The HOA president, who claimed to know nothing, resigned via email the same day his personal vacation cabin was shown to have been built partially with HOA funds. I received a formal request to testify in federal court. Not just as a witness, but as the whistleblower. The badge of that word stuck with me. I'd spent most of my life in uniform, believing in duty, believing in systems, and yet here I was, retired gray in the beard, standing between a protected forest and the slow rot of small-town corruption. I drove up to the ridge that afternoon. Scout jumped into the bed of the truck and rode with his nose to the wind. We parked at the edge of the south trail where the trees had thinned and walked out together. There were still scars on the land. Stumps, broken branches. The path the trucks had carved was now blocked off by a temporary barrier posted by the state. A sign stood in front, nailed to a thick post. Under federal protection. No access, without permit, penalties enforced. And underneath a second plaque, brass and gleaming in the sun, Everett Memorial Ridge, donated by Richard Everett, 1993, protected in perpetuity. I hadn't known they were putting it up. Tears welled up before I could stop them. Scout nudged my leg tail, wagging softly. For the first time in a long while, the forest sounded like itself again, wind threading through the needles, birds returning to the canopy. The silence of something that had survived. That night, I received one final envelope in the mail, hand-delivered by a deputy. It was a petition, signed by 78 households. Request to dissolve the current HOA board and replace governance with independent oversight. They wanted change. Not just punishment. They wanted reform. And they were asking me to help lead it. I stared at the signatures, the ink fresh and trembling. I thought about my father's hands calloused from years of planting and boundary walking. I thought about Scout asleep on the porch. I thought about how close we'd come to losing everything that gave this place its soul. And then I picked up a pen and signed. The next Sunday, I walked into the community clubhouse, not as an outcast or target, but as someone the neighborhood had started calling the man who stood his ground. The same chairs that once circled around Delaney and his loyalists were now rearranged in open rows, and this time every seat was full. There were no HOA banners, no coffee served by board volunteers, no decorum policies posted on the walls, just residents, tired, angry, awakened. I hadn't planned to speak, but then Sandra Holloway stood up. She lived 3 doors down from me, and for years had been one of the most vocal supporters of the HOA. I once heard her publicly accuse a neighbor of lowering property values just because he painted his garage blue. Now her voice shook for a different reason. I voted for them, she said, holding back tears. I trusted them to keep our neighborhood safe and beautiful. I let them find my own sister for planting wildflowers. I'm ashamed. I didn't question anything. The room stayed silent. Then a man in the back shouted, "That's what they wanted." Us afraid to speak, afraid to look too closely. And someone else added, "We didn't know we were paying for their lake house." The tide had turned. I stood slowly, not to command attention, but because they deserved the truth. "I don't blame you," I said. "I don't blame anyone here who believed in the system. That's what makes it work belief. But when that belief is used against us, we have a duty to act, not just to punish, but to protect what's still ours." I held up the map again, the one that had become more powerful than any speech or anger. This isn't about fences or paint colors. It's about land, about legacy, about the right to know that when we walk through our neighborhood, we're walking through a place where the rules apply to everyone. I placed the map on the table and stepped back. The applause wasn't thunderous. It wasn't celebratory. It was quiet, steady, like rain starting to fall after a long drought. That night, the HOA board officially collapsed. The remaining members resigned. No one stepped up to replace them. Instead, a temporary transition committee was formed, elected by open vote, led by a small group of residents, including teachers, retirees, and one environmental science major home from college. They asked me to serve as liaison with the county and the state oversight office. It wasn't a title I wanted, but it was a responsibility I couldn't walk away from. Over the next month, things changed. HOA signs were taken down. The community bylaws were rewritten from scratch. Every financial record was opened and published online. What they found was staggering: over $200,000 of HOA dues spent on non-disclosed contractor services, including private security for Delaney's cabin, legal fees for a zoning exemption in another county, and a landscaping project for a property that wasn't even within Valley Pines boundaries. The backlash was swift. Residents began organizing cleanup days, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. Fences were no longer inspected by clipboard-wielding volunteers. Grass wasn't measured. But the neighborhood never looked better. People planted flowers again, painted murals on sidewalks, built benches under trees that had once been marked for removal. The same woods that had been targeted for destruction became a classroom. Literally. A group of teachers from the local elementary school reached out to the county and asked permission to start a forest stewardship program. Once a month, children hiked the trails, learned about pine regeneration, identified native species, and wrote letters to the trees they wanted to protect. I read one that said, "Dear tree, I'm sorry people hurt you. I hope you're okay. Love, Maddie, 8. It broke me. As for Craig Delaney, Marlene, and Harold Beckett, the charges stuck. Federal prosecutors armed with witness testimony documents, drone footage, and financial records announced they had secured a full indictment under RICO. That had never happened to a homeowners association in our state before. It became national news. CNN called it From Pine Trees to Prison Sentences, the case that changed how we see HOAs. They asked for interviews. I declined, because this was never about fame. This was about principle, about roots, both the ones in the ground and the ones we grow in each other when we refuse to look away. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, I walked the forest line again with Scout. The trucks were gone. The scars in the soil had started to fade under new growth ferns, wild grass saplings, no more than a foot tall. Life returning. We stopped by the ridge, where the new brass plaque glinted in the sun. Beneath it, a smaller wooden sign had been staked by the local school. Welcome to Everett Grove, protected by courage, preserved by community. I bent down and ran my fingers across the carved letters. I could almost hear my father's voice behind me. You stood your ground, son, and now the trees can too. Scout barked once like he heard it too. Then we walked home. The forest healed faster than I did. That's the truth. No one tells you justice when it finally comes doesn't erase what came before. It doesn't unring the chainsaws. It doesn't refill the stumps with bark and life. And it sure as hell doesn't return the years you spent yelling into the wind, hoping someone would listen. But healing, real healing, begins with roots, and my roots ran deep. It was mid-fall when I got the letter from the State Department of Environmental Resources. A formal declaration signed and stamped officially reclassifying the southern parcel of Pine Hollow Preserve as a permanent ecological restoration zone. The document included one new detail: the parcel would be renamed Everett Conservation Tract for the restoration, protection, and education of future generations. Below that, a handwritten note from Laura: for your father's trees and your fight to protect them. You didn't just expose corruption, Daniel. You made space for something to grow. I sat at the kitchen table, Scout asleep at my feet, and cried. I thought about the day I first saw the trucks. I thought about the weight of that man's smug smile, the way he weaponized rules and policies to tear down something sacred. I thought about the letter my father wrote in 1993, typing each word with calloused fingers and pure faith in the law. And then I thought about the kids running through the new forest trails, laughing as they balanced on fallen logs, planting seeds where stumps once stood. Something had changed. Not just around me, in me. 2 months later, I was asked to speak at a town hall in Missoula. Not about fraud, not about RICO statutes or chain of custody, but about land stewardship and what one community could do when they stopped looking away. I brought the map, the same one my father had used all those years ago with his pencil markings and folded corners. I unrolled it on a wooden easel and looked out at the faces: teachers, veterans, families, college students. People who had read about Valley Pines and saw more than a scandal. They saw a warning and a path forward. I told them what I knew, not about law, but about legacy. Your name doesn't end with your bloodline, I said. It continues in the way you treat the land, in what you defend when no one's watching, in whether your community becomes a cage or a garden. And afterward, they lined up, not to shake my hand, but to tell me their stories. I caught our HOA fencing off a public lake trail. We've had missing funds too. I didn't think we were allowed to question them. I listened, because I knew the loneliness that lived inside each of those sentences. And if my story could do anything, it was to remind people they weren't alone. Back in Valley Pines, the old HOA office became a community library. The same room where they once fined a single mom for having wind chimes now hosted workshops on forest ecology, community rights, and civic participation. High schoolers built trail markers as part of their graduation service hours. Retirees volunteered to teach knot tying, bird watching, even soil restoration. On Saturdays, I brought Scout down and sat under the oak tree out front, answering questions from anyone who asked about boundary lines, conservation law, or just how to get started when no one believes you. I never charged a fee. Justice, after all, had already paid me in full. That winter, I received one final package. No return address. Inside was a photograph. Black and white, faded edges. It was my father, 30 years younger, standing at the edge of the ridge, shovel in hand, a pine sapling next to him. On the back, written in faint blue ink, "We plant what we will never see grow. That's the work worth doing." R.E. I framed it, hung it above the mantel next to a photo of the new plaque. And sometimes, when the wind rustles through the trees just right, I swear I can hear him still. You stood your ground, Daniel. Yes, I did. And the trees are still standing too.